everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for a conversation about They Didn't See Us Coming, The Hidden History of Feminism in the 90s with author Lisa Levenstein and special conversation partner Nancy Maclean. My name is Talia. I'm the events manager here at Flyleaf. We are winding down our event season prior to the holidays, but all of our fall events are recorded and available to watch on our Crowdcast profile. So I encourage you to click over to that and scroll through, see if anything interests you. We have almost all of those books still in stock. So if you're interested in looking for holiday presents, that's a great place to start, as is our holiday gift guide on our website, which just went up this week. All of our staff members have posted their list of their top picks of the year, and then we have lists for a bunch of different genres as well. So mystery, sci-fi, fantasy, cookbooks, whatever you're looking for gifts, that's a great place to start as well. If you'd like to support Flyleaf and our guests, you can purchase the book, They Didn't See Us Coming, by clicking the blue button right beneath our faces. You can also come into the store to buy a copy. Our current hours are 11 to 5, Tuesday through Saturday. Or if you've already bought your copy but you'd like to support Flyleaf, you can donate a few dollars. There's a donate button just at the bottom of your screen, and that helps us continue to offer programming. All right, I will go ahead and introduce our authors. Nancy Maclean is an award-winning scholar of the 20th century United States. Her most recent book, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Self-Plan for America, was a finalist for the National Book Award for Nonfiction and the winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in Current Interest. She is a William H. Chafe Distinguished Professor of History and Public Policy at Duke. And Lisa Levenstein, our star tonight, is the director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program and an associate professor of history at UNC Greensboro. Her first book, A Movement Without Marches, won the Kenneth Jackson Book Award. She lives in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And tonight we're talking about her new book, They Didn't See Us Coming. I'm going to jump out of the video and audio, so you won't see me for a little bit, and then I'll pop back at the end to moderate a Q&A. But for now, I'm going to let Lisa and Nancy take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Talia. And I was thrilled to hear that Flyleaf is now open again. I was thinking before this evening that it's one of my favorite bookstores, and one of the things I miss most is just the simple going and browsing the staff picks at Flyleaf. So great to know that you're open, and I am thrilled to be here tonight with Lisa Levenstein, one of the historians and friends I admire most in the world. I have to confess, we're in a writing group together, so I had the great pleasure of seeing this amazing book develop as she was writing it, and it was very hard to limit myself in questions because there's just so much rich material here. But I guess I would just start by orienting our listeners in kind of time and place about your topic. And how did you pick up this thread that other historians missed of looking to the 1990s as a key moment? Because, I have to say, as somebody who, we both got degrees in a women's history program, and so many people were endlessly reiterating the story of 60s and 70s feminism, or jumping forward to, the self-styled third wave of young women in the 2000s. But you went to the 1990s when Time magazine had said that feminism was dead. So what led you to look there? How did you pick up this thread?
Oh, thank you so much, Nancy. It's really so thrilling for me to be here with you talking about this. As you know, I've really spent my whole career trying to understand how social movements work beyond the famous leaders and celebrated instances of mass protests. And I've been particularly interested in looking at the ways people foster social change that don't involve marching on the streets. And I've been really drawn to people who get overlooked because they don't match our stereotype about who's an activist, or in the case of this book, who's a feminist. And so this approach, this looking at people and places not typically associated with social movements, this really proved really fruitful when I turned my attention to the 90s, because as you said, this is the decade that Time magazine ran a cover story in which it proclaimed feminism. It had looked for feminism and the movement had died, right? And this was a very common refrain. Now, I'd always been really suspicious of that narrative. And when I started going to the archives and conducting oral histories, I really found that this was a pivotal decade for US feminism. It was a decade when growing numbers of women of color and working class women who had really been doing feminist activism for decades, but not using the label, they decided they were no longer going to let white women kind of be the ones to publicly define the movement for themselves. It was also a decade when the movement became much more global. It expanded into mainstream institutions and nonprofits. And for the first time, it went online.
That is so cool. Well, and one of the things that you pick up that I never would have thought to look at is the role of the Beijing conference in 1996, and all of these women, tens of thousands of US women who went to this conference in Beijing, many of whom had never traveled out of the country before. You know, China was just opening up then. And there were two people that I knew then who had gone, and it was just like a revelation for them. So it was really exciting to read your work about this. But is there a story that sticks in your mind about this encounter between, you know, with American women going to China in your story that you would like to share?
The Beijing conference, you know, is such a perfect example of the gap between what was reported in the mainstream press and what was actually happening in feminism. So if you were here in the United States reading the newspapers or watching TV about the conference, all you probably would have known is that Hillary Clinton was giving a speech and she proclaimed that women's rights are human rights. In fact, what was also happening at the same time was that 40,000 activists from around the world, including 8,000 from the US, were having a massive feminist conference that lasted for nearly 2 weeks. And one of the people that I interviewed, she told me a great story about what it was like to travel to China at this time. Susan Siegel was a wheelchair rider, and she organized a contingent of 50 women with disabilities from the US to attend the conference. And so you can imagine travel was not the easiest thing. They got themselves on a plane and they landed in the Beijing airport. And, you know, they're exhausted like all of us, right? You know, just jet lag. And they're making their way through the terminal to go through immigration. And they came upon 3 flights of stairs, stone stairs. And the group was about 50 people. Half of them are in wheelchairs. The other half, many of them were blind or deaf. And there were these 3 flights of stone stairs, but then next to it, they spotted 2 elevators. And the elevator close to them wasn't working, was out of order, but the elevator further away seemed to be, you know, going up and down. So they kind of made their way over to the elevator, and they were stopped by the security guards who said, and I mean, there was no English happening here, you know, but he pointed to a line that was drawn on the floor of the terminal. And what became clear to them in the kind of hand signaling that they were doing was that if you were on one side of the line where they were, you were kind of not yet officially in China. And if you went over the line, you needed to go through immigration to be able to go over the line. And the working elevator was over the line. And he said there was just no way they could go on the elevator. And so they were just looking down at these 3 flights of stairs, and they were pleading with him, you know, trying to, you know, explain hand signals were happening and nothing. And finally, he sent some maintenance workers over who started lifting them up, like lifting their wheelchairs up to bring them down the stairs. And they were kind of, I mean, these were not people who were trained to lift wheelchairs. So they're kind of falling out. And they said, you know, they sent the maintenance workers away, and they figured out that they were going to just have to get down the stairs. And they, you know, kind of came up with a plan where, you know, like blind people were helping women who were in wheelchairs get down the stairs. Some of them, and including Susan Siegel, she crawled down 3 flights of stairs. So that was their welcome to China.
Wow.
And interestingly enough, this same group of women at the conference, that there was very little accessibility for women with disabilities at the conference, and they raised some hell, and they organized protests, and they did all kinds of stuff at the conference. And I'm pretty sure that this opening experience really shaped some of that activism that happened later.
Yeah, and I love the way you write about the imprint of that experience and all the new issues that were coming up in the 1990s that women really engaged in the Beijing conference and then brought home. And for me, as somebody who teaches social movement history, it's just so frustrating. And I know my students find it frustrating to see the 60s portrayed as the be all and the end all of activism, as if nothing ever changed thereafter. And that's where you go. And so one of the things I really love about the book is the way that you kind of shake us and say, no, the world changes and activists have to change and think about different things. So what were the feminists that you write about grappling with in the 1990s at Beijing and beyond that 60s nostalgia couldn't really help them with? Like, this was the dawn of our times in a lot of ways. So what did they see that needed new approaches in that period?
Right. So the 90s was a moment when the term globalization, something we hear about all the time right now, is really just starting to enter the public lexicon. And I was really struck by the large numbers of feminists who saw it as their mission to grapple with these massive economic transformations that were happening around the country, around the world. They were really thinking in creative and important ways about what the spread of global capitalism meant for ordinary people. And they were taking their cues in large part from women from the global South, who had been theorizing about things like neoliberalism and talking about the problems with the World Bank and the IMF. They had been doing this work really since the 80s. And in the 90s, US women kind of started to realize what was happening and become really attuned to this work. And many of them used something called popular education, or sometimes they called it economic literacy, programs to help educate and empower community organizations, labor unions, church groups, immigrant groups, really anyone who would listen. And these exercises they came up with were really kind of amazing, really creative. So one of them was called like the World Trade Game. People were divided into groups representing different countries. Someone would play the role of the World Bank, someone would play the role of the IMF, and various things would happen and they would trade things. Another involved participants emptying out the contents of their wallets to assess what that said about their class status. Right? Like, did you have a driver's license? And what did that mean? How many credit cards did you have? How much cash did you have on hand? Right? And kind of thinking through these kinds of small micro issues and also like kind of the macro system.
Wow. And one of the things that really it becomes big and is a chapter in the book is the rise of online activism. And, you know, most of us, we just take it for granted, especially after this election season. We're probably like so sick of online communications. But it's almost hard to remember that all of this had a beginning and needed to be learned as women made the transition and others made the transition into this. But one of the things I loved in the book was these feminist computer geeks who were helping other women like get online and figure out how to do it. Could you tell us about one of those women, Edie Farwell, for example?
Absolutely. In fact, Edie was at a talk I gave last week, so I'm wondering, she may be on the line. If you are, Edie, say hi to us. The 90s, you know, it really was like the cusp of the digital revolution. So if you kind of think back then, there wasn't Google, there wasn't Facebook, there wasn't Twitter, but there was email. And there was the World Wide Web that, you know, and a lot of people, increasing numbers of people got email. The web was still kind of starting to it was less common to have access to it, but that was growing as well. And really one of the biggest surprises that I found in my research was that feminism led all social movements, was one of the leaders in social movements getting online. And it turned out that the Beijing conference was a really important mobilizing event for that. Thousands of people used computers and the internet for the first time in preparation for the conference, really foreshadowing something we see today. They were trying to find information about the conference in the mainstream press. They couldn't find anything, so they went online, right? So it kind of forced them online, and it was like the beginnings of this sense that you could find things online that you couldn't find in the mainstream. And they really, around Beijing, they created all sorts of alternative kinds of information for people to come and look at. One of the truly amazing things about the conference and what happened there was some of the work that was led by Edie Farwell, who gathered group of 40 women from 28 different countries who arrived at the conference a few days earlier to set up a computer center that had 200 machines in it. And I mean, that seems like whatever today, but at the time, this was like cutting edge for any UN conference, for any kind of conference, to have this kind of center that was connected to the internet, and let alone being run by an all-female team, speaking 18 different languages, with the and like large numbers of these women, like the majority, were from the global South. So this was like, and they knew it. They were making a statement about the ability of women to use this technology, to teach each other about this technology, and to help each other learn it. And that's exactly what they did. It would be notable today, really, to have that kind of team in charge of anything technology-wise. And so for many people at the time, the Beijing conference was really their first foray into what today now has become the kind of entire arena of online activism.
Wow, just so fascinating to see that. And also faxes, you were talking about faxes, and just kind of takes you back when you read it. But another thing I wanted to talk about is the interviews that you did, because you did over 120 interviews with activists for this book. And part of what makes the book so rich and such an inspiring read at this moment is the richness of what people shared with you, like a lot of deep personal stories and, the struggles that they had, the questions they thought about as activists. Can you tell us about just one of those interviews that really surprised you, and maybe like your heart started to beat fast because you just couldn't believe, what someone was telling you about?
No, that happened to me several times with many stories, but there's one story that actually got told to me several different times by different people. And every time it was told to me, I kind of got chills. And that was the story about a night at the Beijing conference, actually, that was really, it was pretty extraordinary. What happened is that a gay Chinese activist handed out flyers at the conference announcing that there was going to be a lesbian dance party at a nightclub in like the middle of Beijing. And the flyer had like a little map showing where this nightclub was. And, being an out lesbian in China at this conference wasn't easy for the women who were at the conference who were there. They had this thing called the lesbian tent, which was the police were just all around it all the time, taking photos of them, videoing them, going through their stuff. It really felt quite oppressive to them. So the idea of a night at a disco sounded pretty good. And it also, was kind of adventurous. Oh my gosh, what is this going to be? So many of them took taxis to the nightclub, and they arrived, and there was, they kind of were let out, and they had to walk down a path to get into this building. And there were people with guns, armed, standing on either side. And no one was pulling out the gun, but they were just there. And they had to walk through that there into the nightclub. And when they got inside, there were also like these kind of police armed people of some kind, many of them with cameras, who were taking photos. And still, though, what happened is over time, more and more people showed up. They started to drink a bit. They're at a bar. And then they all just started to take to the dance floor. And really, it seemed like it was really magical, So hundreds of people are there. They can't really speak to each other because they're from all over the world, right? Like they don't have much language in common, but they have this music and they have this dancing. And they just started dancing and kind of in defiance of the police, but also, by all accounts, it was joyous at the same time as it was resistance. And I think for many of the US women I talked to who were there also said it was this real moment of recognizing their privilege, right? That they could not be worried if the camera was going to take their photo, that they were, that wasn't something that they were worried about. It's interesting, those of you, if you've seen the book, you've seen that I did reprint the flyer in it. And when I needed to go and get permission and stuff, it turned out I got in touch with the guy who had organized this event, Gary Wu. and he was a dissident, and he was detained after the event. And then in 1996, he left China, and he now lives in San Diego. And it turns out he has video footage of, so if there's any, historian on the line who needs a topic, he has like still copies of the flyer, all kinds of stuff. So, I mean, it's pretty amazing. And it was really cool to get in touch with him as well.
That's great. I just got chills when you were talking about that. One of the reasons I love this book so much as someone who teaches about the history of social movements and, tries to think about what's happening in our time is that the kind of analysis you provide of the choices and the challenges that these feminist activists were faced with and the choices they had to make, they really apply to every movement, in our time. And you really pull them apart in such a powerful way, things from like keeping members engaged to fundraising and dealing with foundations, professionalization, all of these different questions. And one of the things I like most about it is you don't simplify, you don't make it like good choices, bad choices. You really just try to understand the two sides of things, or they sometimes many more than two sides. And you help us understand why good, savvy, committed activists made the choices that they did. Could you share with us one maybe episode or one issue where it really brought home to you the kind of moral ambiguity that committed activists sometimes face, especially when dealing with, very powerful, well-funded enemies, or opponents, and they're like, trying to figure out how to keep the lights on and get people paid. Like, just maybe share something that stuck with you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, one of the things that was different about social movements in the 90s, and one of the reasons many people thought feminism was dead, was that when it was in fact thriving, was that so many people were getting paid to do various forms of activism, right? So they worked in nonprofits, in a rape crisis center, a domestic violence shelter, or they held jobs in mainstream institutions like think tanks or law firms, or like us, like in universities, right? So what struck me in thinking through this, it's really not a single story, but the fact that almost everyone I interviewed, or many of the people I interviewed, was in some way navigating how to remain true to their political principles while trying to accommodate the people who were signing their paychecks, right? And so, Nancy, you described it as morally ambiguous. I'm not sure any of them ever did anything they felt was wrong, right? Or immoral. But I mean, anyone who has like applied for a job or applied for funding from a foundation or a grant knows that you have to kind of package yourself in a certain way and perhaps do work that isn't always like the work you're most passionate about, or you might not feel is the most necessary. And so the people I study, the feminists I studied in the 90s, particularly women of color working in grassroots organizations, they were really attuned to these compromises. They thought a lot about them, they wrote a lot about them, and they really strategized about how to raise money and still do the work that they cared about the most.
Okay. Well, we want to take questions from people who are listening in a minute, but before we do that, I'd just like to ask a last question that kind of bridges the history that you share here with our own moment. And one of the movements that's certainly been most transformative in our time is the movement for Black Lives, which has so profoundly changed consciousness about systemic racism in America's past and present. And it was launched by Black queer women in a dynamic that really seems connected in important ways to the story you tell. Could you share with us how the research that you did helps illuminate this extraordinary women-led mobilization that has also, really changed the public conversation about race and brought so many into activism now?
Yeah. Well, first, let me just say that there are entire books by people like the historian and activist Barbara Ransby that trace the origins of Black Lives Matter and explain what it means that it was launched by Black queer women. But I will say that when I was finishing writing my book in the midst of Black Lives Matter, I was really struck by the connections. And my last chapter focuses on 3 organizations of women of color that fundamentally reconceptualized core feminist issues. Incite, Women of Color Against Violence, which taught people that we can't understand domestic and sexual violence without connecting these experiences to state violence, including the racism of the legal and immigration systems. Another was Sister Song, Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, that showed us that we had to think about the struggle for abortion rights much more broadly as part of a broader struggle for bodily integrity. And Southerners on New Ground, Song. Some people on the call are from that organization, a group of Southern Black and white lesbians who emphasized that the struggle for gay rights had to go beyond a focus on marriage equality or employment discrimination to include issues like poverty and racism and immigration. So when it came time to write the epilogue for the book, I realized that all three of these organizations that I had focused on in this last chapter, and all of which still exist, they all had played a part in Black Lives Matter. They were integral to Black Lives Matter being not just about the struggles of Black men, but also about Black women, and to including the struggles of queer people. And so, I think the bigger point that is really a fitting end for the conversation is that Black Lives Matter, like all social movements, didn't just kind of emerge, right? It's built on decades of activism, by really committed people, many of them women and queer.
Great. Well, let's, I think, bring Talia in to see if there are questions from the audience. If not, I feel like I could go on talking with you for another couple hours about all this, but I'm sure there's others who want to raise their questions.
Of course. It looks like we already have one. Maria asks, Lisa, I wonder if you have any thoughts about the current activism of some very young women who may or may not identify explicitly as feminists. I'm thinking of both famous figures like Greta Thunberg and also lesser known figures like Jania Taylor, Breonna Taylor's sister, who spent months trying to get attention paid to her sister's murder.
Oh, thank you so much for that question. I think that really does connect in many ways to the story I started to trace in the 90s, where people are increasingly a feminist framework, a feminist way of thinking about the world, a way of thinking about the world that includes attention to gender, but doesn't necessarily prioritize it above other issues, but just kind of has a more holistic view about justice, there's a long strain of that, right? That's like centuries old, but it really started to come more to the fore and be, kind of publicly defined as feminism in the 90s. And I really see these young activists today kind of continuing to blaze that trail in really inspiring ways. Mm-hmm. So absolutely. And I would say that that's part of this longer tradition that I'm trying to trace. Thank you for bringing those women up.
I would toss one thing in here too, to just put you on the spot, Lisa, as a mom, but also the young women of today are being raised by the women who came through those earlier years, right? And being encouraged. And I know your own daughter, Anna, is pretty activist and pretty engaged with politics and community life and stuff. So I'll bet there's that dimension too of, the way parenting changed for people who were involved in this struggle.
Absolutely, right? And so, people who were coming of age in the 90s, or people in the 90s, intersectionality was this new term. And now today we're talking about how it's being co-opted, right? And so, there really is a shift in terms of what we're seeing. Yeah, thanks for that.
All right. I have one question here from Lori, who asks, how would you connect your story from the 90s to the decades before that?
Yeah, thank you. I think that movements, they grow out of each other, right? And so one of the things I found most fascinating in doing this research, because it went against a kind of framework that had been used in other previous works, was the idea that each generation rejects the generation before it, right? And so that the activism of one generation is somehow like answering the other and in tension with the other. And what I found was, there was a lot, there still is, there always will be. It's a social movement. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of people who don't strong-willed people who who disagree with each other about like what the priorities should be and what we should be doing and like where we're going, right? So there's always going to be like a lot of different visions of what needs to happen. But I was struck by the way that it did not always go along generational lines, right? So you had many people who had been active in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and they were still active in the 90s, and they're working with young people, right? They kept this activism moving. And there was some really important intergenerational coalitions, or maybe even just like people working across generations. And what mattered was your politics, I think, more than when you were born. And that was really interesting to see, and also really inspiring, honestly, to see the kind of intergenerational work that was happening, and particularly to see people who had been kind of in the trenches since the 60s still doing this work, and still doing it really on, and not necessarily being like the more conservative side, right? Still like being maybe even on the more radical edge.
Could I pop in another question there about a particular individual? Because
Sure.
Part of what I think the oral histories enable, and the research that you did on the lives of the women who were involved in this, is like sometimes social movement scholarship is written in a way that you just see someone in one period of their activism, right? Civil rights, labor, global, whatever. But you see people who go, they evolve with their time. So I was thinking of Charlotte Bunch is kind of a particular example, maybe to Lori's question too, of somebody who just brought so many different streams of experience to the work that she did. And she was such a bridge builder for global feminism too.
Absolutely. And it's such a great example, right? Because she went to Duke, and she was involved in the civil rights movement here, right? And got her start doing that kind of racial justice work, then became, got really involved, moved to DC, started working with a think tank, and then got very involved in lesbian separatism, right? And if you turn to the furries, like she was in that collective, and then expanded, and then really decided that separatism wasn't the way to go, and we needed to make coalitions, we needed to be broader. And not only did she go broad, when she decided she was going to go broad, she went broad, right? And she really took on the global and became extremely involved in global feminism, and actually one of the real leaders in the women's human rights movement. That's a great example, Nancy, of someone on, kind of the life that we can see in her.
I love those stories.
All right. I have a question here from Corinne, who says, how do you think media representation of feminism in the 90s affected the feminist movement?
That's such a great question. Well, that really was so fascinating, because in terms of media representation, there wasn't a lot. And it really was pretty sparse. Time magazine, there were art, it was like the most stereotypical in terms of feminism is just dead and we're not going to even bother reporting on it. But in general, the media didn't know where to look. And I want to kind of recall what Nancy was saying about like scholars thinking about like activism and feminism is about the 60s, right? And like having that like social movements happened in the 60s and the 70s. And I think that's really just what people, really even today a bit, like people think. And so it's like you're looking for the movements, the people in the press, the mainstream press, they were looking for the movements of the 60s and the 70s, right? They're looking for the protest against the Miss America pageant that, got so much press. They're looking for these kinds of sit-in at the Ladies' Home Journal, like these kinds of iconic pieces of activism. And then when they weren't seeing feminism as that, they didn't know where to find it, right? So they didn't know really where to look, because the model was one that was really still rooted in what social movements looked like in the 1960s and 1970s. So there were those big abortion rights marches, right? So that all got coverage, but it just ended up making it seem as if feminism was abortion rights, when it was so much more than that.
Okay, I have another connection question. Can you please speak about the connection between the anti-apartheid movement and 90s feminism? And that's from Justina.
Oh, thank you, Justina. Oh, one of my graduate students. Hi. That's such a great question. It was so interesting for me to see that, as Nancy and I were talking about, one of the things that happened in the 90s was that US feminism, which is what my book is about, people really were starting to think in much more global terms, right? They were thinking about themselves in the world at large. And a lot of the activists, and some of that was what I was saying earlier, globalization is happening, the internet, all of these things that are increasingly connecting us. But for a lot of people, it was work in the anti-apartheid movement, right? That also was, a lot of people who were active in feminism in the 90s had also been active in the movement against apartheid. Many also in various forms of Central American solidarity movements, right? They were doing this kind of work, and that work in the 80s really laid the groundwork for some of the activism that they engaged in later.
Okay. And then I have another question that's sort of related the other way. So we've talked about how there's a connection between 90s feminism and a global movement or an international movement. Then we have a question from Jenny, which is, one of my own connections to 90s feminism is the Riot Girl movement, which I think of as largely US based. How did that fit into the global picture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't look as much at the Riot Girl movement because there's been so many great books already written about it. And I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know how much of that had a kind of global contingent, because I think of it as being very local, actually. I think of it as being, I think of that also just the importance of things like zines in that movement and the way that they were being kind of distributed one-on-one and they were being mailed to people. Maybe they were being mailed abroad. I really don't know. That's a great question. I would love to know the answer to it. But I think that it was certainly one of the more well-known at the time representations of feminism, and I would love to know the degree to which it traveled globally.
Mm-hmm. All right. Does anyone else have any questions? I think that's it. Maybe Nancy, if you have one that you want to throw out, we can hear another question from you.
I'll ask Nancy questions as well.
Yeah, of course, of course.
She's here for a reason. Please do.
You know what? I'll ask a question that relates to teaching. Often the books that scholars write sometimes have to do with their frustrations with the literature that they have to teach their students, right? And you start thinking, well, that isn't really the way to look at this. And so maybe was there an element of that for you in this book, that you were, teaching women's history and feeling like, I don't think people are getting what's important here? Maybe you've said that, but could you think about that particularly in teaching terms?
Yeah, I think that one of the things I wanted to do with this book was make it really kind of concrete. Mm-hmm. And I feel so it was my goal, for instance, never to say race, class, and gender at all. Like I didn't use those three words together in the book, because I felt like there were these ways that there was a certain kind of language that was getting used in the classroom that was not illuminating anything specific, right? And people were just kind of using these catchphrases that weren't actually rooted in the real work that people were doing. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted us to kind of come back to think about real people doing real work of organizing and what that meant, and to think about why people do this work, right? What draws them to it? What keeps them engaged? why do people keep doing it when it's, so can be so frustrating, like what brings them to the work and what that work actually was. So to really kind of ground us in a sense of place and a sense of people. And what I found so cool about doing the research was that it was just really, everyone's just like an ordinary person, right? And just like you and me, and doing things that were so interesting and so really inspiring in many ways. And so just to kind of ground us there rather than up here. And that was what I found for me was the most compelling part of doing this research.
That's great. I'll just say, maybe if we're wrapping up, this book is such a wonderful read in general, but also in this moment. I think we've just been through one of the most harrowing, we've just been through one of the most harrowing elections of our lifetimes. And it's still going on, and it's protracted, and it can be dispiriting. And so to me, I think of history as an antidepressant, and this book could be like Exhibit A.
Except for your history.
How beautiful it is. But it also,
your history, Nancy, is a depressant.
like, to remember that, in the 1990s, so much was changing, so much was frustrating, so much was new. People didn't think activists could break through. They were saying movements were dead, all that kind of language. And yet you show this was an incredible moment of sort of regrouping, of transformation, of people getting their minds around these big new developments that laid the foundations for so much that came after. And the fact that you write it with these just incredibly compelling women from all these different domains, I love the stories. And I think it's something that will really lift people up, especially after this whatever it is. It's been a year, months, 4 years, depending on how you count, or a few really concentrated weeks. But it is, as people also, the people who are teaching and students on the call, as you're shifting toward the holidays and wrapping up your classes, it's the kind of book that you just want to, put your feet up on the couch and get a nice cup of tea and just really settle in and remember that history is your friend and can really, really help you, especially when it's written beautifully by such a brilliant person. So,
thank you so much, Nancy. Coming from you, that means so much.
All right. Before we wrap up, we have a couple more questions that came through. We have a question from Lisa T, who said, what happened to the oral interviews you did? Are they archived, or will they be? And how did you navigate writing about live people who could talk back?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa T, one of my closest friends, and hi, Lori, as well. So it's such an interesting question, and I did do 120 interviews, and I had them transcribed. I haven't deposited them anywhere because that wasn't part of the agreement I had with the women who I worked with, and I didn't have a sponsoring archive. So I haven't gotten to that stage with them yet. But what writing about live people was challenging, especially, but it was also really rewarding because there was a certain kind of back and forth I had with many of them. I actually gave everybody who I interviewed, who I quoted, I gave them an opportunity to read what I had written and offer me feedback. I said that, I wasn't going to necessarily take the feedback. That didn't mean I would have necessarily changed something if I saw it a different way, because they had their experience. I had their experience plus other people's experiences plus the archives, right? Plus I had all these other sources that were showing me the story, and they had their experience, which was important, but wasn't the only thing I was weighing in writing this story. But I gave everybody the opportunity to read it and offer me feedback. And it was very interesting, this like people's personalities, right? Some were like on it. Others were just like, no worries. I don't, whatever you wrote is absolutely fine, happy. And so there was a real difference in the kinds of feedback I got. And I basically did what I told them. I took their feedback into consideration. Some of them I went back and forth a few times with, but some of them, we didn't ever quite get to the place, I think, that they are as happy with it as I might have wanted them to be. But it was a back and forth, and it was it was a conversation between us, and in which I really tried to respect what, their experiences and make sure that I was not in any way misrepresenting something that had happened. And it was quite a meaningful experience for me, actually, this back and forth that I had with several people in trying to get their stories right. Historically accurate, not just like something they wanted to see in the book, but something that was true as a historian could ever get.
It's a tough thing for sure. All right, and we have one last question from Bob Korstad, who we were just talking about earlier, another person who did an event with us this season. Could you talk about the regional differences in the U.S. and how they related to the feminist movement?
Oh, that's a great question. That's why it was really interesting and I think important for me to end with those movements, Incite, Southerners on New Ground, and Sister Song. Two of them were in the South and very much rooted in the South, and saw that as a very important component of their activism. And it really helps us to shatter stereotypes about where we think this kind of activism was happening, right? So the South was had a far richer and more vibrant and actually really cutting edge movement than most people know about. Another really key area, region of activism was the Southwest, where the environmental justice, the environmental justice / labor movement was taking off in the 90s, especially around NAFTA and around issues about NAFTA and free trade. There was all kinds of activism happening between working class women of color in the US and women working in the maquiladoras in Mexico. A lot of interchange there. A lot of it was about labor issues, but a lot of it was also about the environment. And this is like where the environmental justice movement was really taking off in the Southwest. And working class women of color were really central to that movement. Many of them may not have at the beginning of their activism identified as feminists, but other feminists started to realize what was happening and get in touch with them and seek them out and start to make these kinds of connections that made them realize that they had more of a connection to this movement than they knew, because the movement was different than they knew. And they, in fact, were part of the movement. So that was a really eye-opening part of my research, and one that I found really helps us not to see social movements always as kind of rooted in the Northeast, where that's where the most radical stuff is happening and everything kind of filters down. It was a much more dynamic kind of landscape. So thank you, Bob, for that question. It's wonderful.
And finally, we just have a couple comments. Jacqueline Hall, who is also an author, says, "What a fabulous dialogue. It strikes me that the feminism of the 60s and 70s was also wrongly represented by the media. The focus on things like the Miss America pageant set up a straw narrative against which later activism was compared." I think that definitely relates to what you were just saying about, women who were doing this work in the movement and didn't even know they were, because the movement had been so misrepresented as this very specific thing that was not quite really true to what it actually was. We also have a comment in the chat from Debbie, who says, "As the transcriber, I can tell you that Lisa did a remarkable job turning all those interviews into an exciting, informative book."
Oh,
So
Debbie was my transcriber, and it was really wonderful to work with someone. I mean, she and I would sometimes reflect on the interview afterwards, because she was typing them up, right? And really was so immersed in them. And which, it was just so interesting to hear her perspectives on them, And there were several, I remember particularly, there was one I did quite a few interviews with Muslim American women that really, and Debbie was raised in a small town in North Carolina, Christian, and that really helped, really bridged some gaps and really were just so eye-opening, and we talked about them, and it was really a wonderfully collaborative process. And so I'm so glad, Debbie, that you wrote that, and that helps answer Lisa T's question about the oral histories as well. It was such a rich and really phenomenal process.
All right, so we are going to go ahead and wrap up for the night. Thank you both so much for joining us. It was such a delight to have you both for my last event of the season. Again, if you are interested in purchasing Lisa's book or her previous book or any of Nancy's books, you can click the blue button just beneath our faces or go to flyleafbooks.com. We also have our gift guide posted on our website. It's linked on the homepage. If you're looking for some things for friends and family this holiday season, or just treating yourself, I totally would understand that too. And check out our Crowdcast profile once again to access all our past event recordings. This event is being recorded and will be available at the same link just as soon as we wrap up. It'll transform into a video. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Thank you again for joining us. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye. Thank you, Talia.
Thank you, Talia.
Bye.
Bye, Lisa.